We're joined now by the Immigration Minister, Chris Bowen. Welcome.
Pleasure, Chris.
What's Plan B?
Well, we're concentrating on Plan A. All we're asking for here is the right to implement government policy. Mr Abbott said a couple of weeks ago that he thought the government of the day should have the ability to implement its policy, and we want that, and we agree that that's right. We've said we don't expect Mr Abbott to endorse Malaysia, we don't expect him to agree with it, just as we won't endorse or agree with the Nauru option. We think that would be a bad option, but we think if Mr Abbott were the Prime Minister, he should have the ability and capacity to implement it, just like we are seeking the ability and capacity to implement the Malaysian arrangement.
But he's effectively knocked back your solution tonight, and you were blindsided by the High Court decision. Surely you won't be blindsided by the opposition saying, no, you must have a contingency plan.
Well, we're concentrating on what we've been seeking to implement. Now, let's be clear, Chris. Mr Abbott has announced his amendments. We'll need to see how they play out. He'll need to try and convince both houses of Parliament to implement those amendments. That's far from clear. Nobody should predict what the result of that would be. I'm not predicting what the result should be. Mr Abbott shouldn't predict that. He would need to convince the crossbenchers in the lower house. He'd need to convince the Greens in the upper house, and the Greens are on the public record saying they don't support the bill and they won't support Liberal Party amendments.
But effectively, if this standoff continues, offshore processing is dead.
Well, it's certainly very difficult and as you say, very clearly, in most cases, unlawful. And yes, I think the point you're trying to make, I agree with. Both parties in Parliament, both major parties, agree with offshore processing. Both major parties support it. All we're asking for is Mr Abbott to work in the national interest to try and legislate for it. Now, today he put, frankly, politics before the national interest. The reason I think he's proposing these amendments is very clearly to try and stop the Malaysia arrangement. Now, he has the advice from the experts, that the Malaysia arrangement is the best one as a deterrent. I think it's open now for the Australian people to conclude that the only reason he's proposing these amendments is to stop the Malaysia agreement because he's been told it can work and it will work, and he doesn't want it to work because it's not in his political interest for it to work.
No, and he wants to kill this government, but what makes you think that tomorrow this won't be your problem? It's certainly not going to be his.
Well, look, we have a very clear policy, and our policy is to implement the Malaysian arrangement. Now, Mr Abbott has very hypocritically today said that he will propose an amendment that it should only apply to refugee signatory countries. Now, this is at the same time as his policy is to turn around the boats on the high seas and point them towards Indonesia, not a signatory to the Refugee Convention, no protections negotiated, no guarantees about non-refoulement, no guarantees about schooling or access to health or education. And yet he says somehow for the government to negotiate this arrangement with Malaysia and to get those guarantees, even though they're not a signatory country, is somehow wrong. He is the one with the big inconsistency here.
But certainly, and let's assume for the moment, for the purposes of this discussion, that everything you say about him is true. Tomorrow morning, it will still be your problem and not his. What makes you think that he will support you tomorrow when he's not supporting you tonight?
Look,
that given, what do you do?
Well, Mr Abbott's position is a matter for him. He's clearly acting in his own political interest. Now, as I say, Chris, whether he can get his amendments through is an open question. Nobody should predict the vote in either House of Parliament because this is an unpredictable thing. And certainly I'm not seeking to predict it. Mr Abbott has not yet made clear, if his amendments fail, whether he will support the government's bill. And that would be in the national interest. He could try his amendments, but say, if they fail, I do support offshore processing, therefore in the national interest I will support the bill. And if he's fair dinkum, that's the only logical position for him to take.
For a moment, in a triumph of optimism over experience, let's assume that at some point he does support you and your bill goes forward. It does not provide a legally binding guarantee that people will get the refugee rights, which you say you've got assurances for, does it?
Well, there's been some criticism and some commentary about that, not only today but in recent weeks. I make this point. Malaysia has entered into this agreement in good faith, and I think the criticism of Malaysia by the opposition is very severely misplaced.
It's an assurance, it's not legally binding, isn't it?
It's not legally binding on Malaysia or Australia.
And you wouldn't buy a car based on an assurance?
Well, it's not legally binding on Australia either, our commitments under the arrangement, and that's fair enough. This is an arrangement. Now, nobody forced Malaysia to go into this. Why would Malaysia give these commitments to Australia, negotiate this in a painstaking fashion over a period of months between the Australian government and the Malaysian government, and then not honour its commitments? And And frankly, I find it offensive that the opposition gets up and says, well, you can't trust Malaysia. I mean, Malaysia is a sovereign government and a friend of Australia, working with Australia on these issues. They could have said to me when I first approached them last December, well, look, we appreciate this, but we're not going to be involved in this. They didn't. They sat down in good faith and negotiated these changes. They have been developing changes in the way they deal with these issues. Prime Minister Najib made announcements just last week about changes, very significant changes to Malaysian law.
Do you accept that no matter what happens from here on, it is the government that will wear the blame and not the opposition, no matter what you might say?
Well, the situation is, Chris, we are the government, but we have the situation where the opposition says it supports offshore processing, but is saying they're going to make it difficult and may say they'll vote against the legislation. Now, we'll be making the point very clearly that if you want offshore processing, and we believe it is an effective deterrent when part of a properly negotiated and thought through regional framework, which this is, that's a deterrent for people getting on the boats to come to Australia and making that dangerous boat journey. Now, if offshore processing doesn't occur, and Mr Abbott hasn't acted in the national interest, and he's put his political interests first, then we're entitled as the government to be regularly pointing that out.
And pointing it out, but also if that does happen, then do you have a contingency plan?
Well, as you say, Chris, then clearly, if there's no offshore processing, then there's only one conclusion, that the processing needs to occur onshore.
And because of that, we'll see a surge of boats. That's your expectation?
Well, I've made it clear that offshore processing and the Malaysia arrangement is an important deterrent, and it's had an announcement effect, and it would have a further effect if it was implemented. And clearly, if you don't have that, then yes, you are removing the disincentive to come to Australia by boat.
And then would mandatory detention have to be reconsidered?
Well, look, I'm not going to get into those hypotheticals yet. Our policy is mandatory detention, let me be clear. We have moved considerable numbers of people out of detention. There are about 2,000 less people in detention centres and facilities than just in April because of the changes this government's made to a variety of mechanisms, and also because of the reduction in the number of boat arrivals, which means less pressure. So we have had an increase in capacity because we've moved a considerable number of people into the community, and we continue with those programs very clearly.
Chris Bowen, thank you.
Thanks, Chris.